Safe, reliable drinking water. It's something that we use every day, whether to make coffee, clean clothes, wash dishes, shower with, cook with, and even flush the toilet. In fact, modern life would not be possible without this amazing resource. And that's where Raleigh Water comes in. We provide water services to over 600,000 people, not only in Raleigh, but also in Rolesville, Wake Forest, Garner, Wendell, Knightdale, and Zebulon. But many people might not know where their water comes from, how it's treated, and how it's actually delivered to them. So now we're going to go on a little trip to find out exactly where your water comes from and how we get it to your tap. So if you want to know where your drinking water starts, it's right here, in the creeks and streams that drain into a reservoir. It may look like I'm in the North Carolina Mountains with the rock formations behind me, but I'm actually in North Raleigh, right beside Honeycutt Creek. This creek drains into Falls Lake, and I'm in the Falls Lake watershed. And think of a watershed as just basically a big bowl that catches all the water and rainfall in a given area. So it may rain in, let's say, Durham or Granville County. It will eventually drain into Falls Lake through these creeks and streams. And you'll also notice there's usually water in these streams. I think of them as nature's faucets, which means even if it's not raining, the groundwater table is high enough to make sure that there's water in there, except for very dry periods or droughts. But we also, in the city of Raleigh, have to manage our watershed a little bit differently because most of our watershed lies outside of not only our jurisdiction, but most of it lies outside of Wake County. It's in 6 other counties upstream of us. So we've created a watershed protection program to try to acquire easements and conservation projects to make sure that the land around these critical streams stays in a natural condition. So this is the first step in where we get our drinking water from. So it starts here in these little creeks and streams, and it's going to drain into Falls Lake. That's where we'll go next. I should also mention that we have 2 water sources. Falls Lake is one, the other one is Lake Benson. That's part of the Swift Creek watershed, and that's basically in Garner and parts of Cary. So it's significantly smaller, but it's also a critically important water source for us. Okay, next stop, Falls Lake. So, as promised, here we are at Falls Lake, and I'm going to start off with a little history about Falls Lake. It was completed in 1983 by the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's who owns and operates Falls Lake. It's not the city of Raleigh or even the state of North Carolina. And there were 3 main rivers that drain into Falls Lake. That is the Eno River, the Little River, and the Flat River. They drain areas mainly out of Durham County and Person County. But there's lots of other streams and creeks that also drain into the basin, and Honeycutt Creek, where I was just at, is one of them. So the lake, when it was built, had 5 main benefits, one of which was wildlife habitat. So that's habitat for aquatic species that would not be anywhere but a lake. There's also bald eagles in this area as well. There's also recreation, of course. So that is fishing, boating, kayaking. All of these things are a benefit to the area around Falls Lake. There's also flood control. That's one of the major reasons why they build lakes like Falls Lake and Lake Jordan, is to help during tropical storm events, for instance, trap some of that water and protect some of the downstream areas from flood events. And there's also water quality. So if water comes into the lake during a storm event, has a lot of sediment in it, hopefully that sediment will drain out. So by the time it leaves Falls Lake, you have a higher level of water quality. And of course, last but not least is water supply. So right now, we have access to 18.7 billion gallons of water in Falls Lake. It holds over 32 billion gallons of water. So we've got a large portion of that dedicated just to water supply. The other portion of that is dedicated for downstream releases to make sure there's always water in the river. And when I say we have 18.7 billion gallons, that's at full pool. What does that mean? That means the lake elevation is 251.5 feet above mean sea level. So Riceville Beach or Atlantic Beach, we're 251.5 feet above that. So that's when it's full. Anything above that is flood storage. So obviously this lake is very important in the city of Raleigh. In fact, it provides 80% of our drinking water on a given day. We use about 52 million gallons of water on average in the city of Raleigh. And again, 80% of that comes from here. The other 20% comes from Lake Benson and Garner, and it's treated at the Dempsey-Benton treatment plant, which is also located in Garner. But next, I'm going to continue going downstream to the dam. Now we're at the downstream end of Falls Lake where the dam is located. At this point, it's approximately 60 feet deep when the lake is at full pool. And this is obviously much deeper than it is around, let's say, the Highway 85 bridge, where the water can be only a few feet deep. And this area can also be exposed during dry weather conditions and droughts, but there's still a tremendous amount of water in the deeper parts of the lake by the dam. It's also where the Neuse River is essentially recreated. The water is released through gates at the base of the dam, and the water flows through a concrete channel called a tail race. And this is actually visible from old Falls of the Neuse Road. And this flow can be controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so it can release a certain amount of water every day to ensure there's water for downstream needs during dry weather conditions. And conversely, they can hold water back during heavy rain events, so it allows for downstream flooded areas to drain and the water to recede before they release water from the lake. Okay, the next stop is the water treatment plant. So from Falls Lake, water is then pumped to this point right here, which is a raw water reservoir. And these reservoirs are where we store water before the actual treatment process starts. We actually have 2 of these reservoirs here at the E.M. Johnson Water Plant, each holding about 70 million gallons of water. But due to the size of these reservoirs, they can actually have problems similar to what you would see in a pond, which is algae growth during certain times of the year. So we address that by installing these things called shade balls. So there's thousands of these black shade balls covering the surface of the reservoir, and they block out the sun so that algae can't grow. So it's one less thing we have to worry about in the treatment process. So from here, we're off to the treatment plant. So this is where the water treatment process really begins in earnest. I'm at the Flock-Sed basin of our water treatment plant, and there's 3 main steps that happen here. The first step is called coagulation, and that's where we add a chemical called ferric sulfate and uniformly mix it within the water column. The next step is flocculation, and that's where that chemical really starts to take effect, and it makes any suspended solids or anything floating in the water column to stick together and bind into clumps. The final step here is sedimentation, and that's when those clumps get heavy enough to sink to the bottom. So when that happens, the water in the top half of the water column starts to get pretty clear. From there, this water, the clear water, goes to the next step called ozonation. The next step is to inject ozone. And what you are seeing here are ozone generators. And ozone is a very powerful oxidant that not only can destroy microorganisms and bacteria, but also can break down organic compounds, which could potentially lead to taste and odor issues in drinking water. Okay, so after the ozonation process, the water comes here. And this is the water filter that normally would be filled with filter media and, of course, water. But right now, we're rehabbing some of the filters here at the E.M. Johnson Water Treatment Plant, something we do every 10 to 15 years. So this is a rare opportunity to see the inside of a water filter chamber. So the water comes from these troughs right here. It actually spills over these troughs. You can kind of see one here in the corner of the screen. And then the water starts to trickle through a series of filter media. And our basic filter media looks a lot like this, if you can see this. So the top layer is about 18 inches of erythrocite, which is a black crystalline material that does a great job of capturing anything that made it past the sedimentation and ozonation process. After that, there's about a foot of sand, and then the last layer is a foot of different size stone. Once it gets through these different layers, we're at the bottom, and this waffle-shaped structure here behind me is called a wheeler bottom. So the water is actually draining from the top of this chamber all the way through the bottom. So once that has happened, the water then goes to the disinfection process.
After the water leaves the filters, it is transferred to the clear well, which is what you see here. A clear well is a tank. In this case, most of it is underground, where we store water that has gone through the treatment process at the plant. We also adjust disinfection here to make sure we have the proper amount of chlorine. And essentially, this is the last step before water is transferred into the water distribution system. You'll also notice solar panels on top of this tank. And we have these panels because it gets a lot of sunlight throughout the day to collect energy and help offset some of the treatment costs and energy consumed. Treated water is now pumped from the clear wells to elevated storage tanks throughout our service area. There are 26 of these tanks in our distribution system, and they are located at high elevation points for a given area so that we can maintain an average pressure of around 75 psi. These tanks come in many different shapes and sizes, with the storage volume ranging between 500,000 gallons up to 2 million gallons.
So now that we have the water in the elevated storage tanks, how do we get it to our customers? Well, we do that through what we call the water distribution system, which is a network of pipes that range in diameter from 36 inches all the way down to less than an inch. And we have over 2,500 miles of these distribution pipes within our service area. So think of them as the roadway for our drinking water. But unlike roads, the distribution system is largely underground, but there are a few telltale signs, like this right here, a fire hydrant. We have over 25,000 of these hydrants in our system. And of course, they're used for firefighting, but they are connected to the potable water supply. Another common sign you'll see is a water valve. Usually you'll see these in the street, but we use these water valves to control the direction of water, and also if we need to isolate a section of the system to repair a water line, we can do that with these valves. We have over 70,000 of these valves. So now that the water is in the distribution system, the next stop is your house and your water meter. So the water has now gone through the distribution system and it has arrived at your house to this point right here, which is the water meter. This is how we measure the amount of water a customer uses. And we do that by reading a signal which comes from that silver disc right there, which is an antenna that emits a signal that we can actually pick up as we drive by in a vehicle. So we no longer have to actually lift the lid and manually read an analog gauge. We measure the amount of water that a customer uses in a unit called a CCF, which is 100 cubic feet or 748.1 gallons. The average customer uses about 5 CCFs per month. So from this point, the water now goes through a small diameter service line into your house and is ready for you to use.